Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt today discusses Africa, Revolution in Haste, with Ralph Bunn Ward on Prospects of Mankind.
Recorded Sunday, March 6, 1960, in cooperation with Brandeis University. National Educational Television presents the WGBH-TV production, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, Prospects of Mankind.
The cry in Africa today is Uhuru, freedom. And freedom is coming fast. The past 5 years saw the spectacular birth of 5 new nations. Among them, Nkrumah's Ghana. Last year's map is already out of date because the momentum is increasing so rapidly. 1960 sees the long-awaited birth of Nigeria, of Somalia, and to everyone's surprise, the Belgian Congo. Kenya and Tanganyika are following fast behind with an orderly transfer of power from all-white rule to a multiracial system. How smooth this transition will be depends on Africa's leaders. Julius Nyerere has already changed the motto of his revolution from freedom to freedom and toil. And toil there is going to be, to break away from the centuries-old patterns of thinking, to achieve the backing and trust of the tribal elders, to overcome their suspicion and hostility, to train a new generation of craftsmen, artisans, people able to take the first steps toward building a modern economy, technicians who can handle a slide rule, scientists who can develop or apply better agricultural methods and raise the subsistence standards, medical workers who can attack the special diseases of this continent. Educational facilities must be expanded quickly in these formative years of independence. To throw off the old humilities of racial superiority, the Africans are seeking modern forms of government. They may not follow exactly the European parliamentary traditions which have risen out of the alien culture. But where the hand of friendship and understanding is extended, Europe and the United States can help to avert some of the more dangerous pitfalls. In some places, the road to the 20th century will be a transform itself from the old to the new.
Today, Mrs. Roosevelt and her guests explore the problems faced by the new nations of Africa as they gain their independence with unprecedented speed. Her guests are Ralph Bunche, Nobel Peace Prize winner and United Nations Undersecretary for Special Political Affairs, Barbara Ward, Lady Jackson, a resident of Ghana and a distinguished economist and writer, currently a lecturer at Harvard University, Saville Davis, managing editor of the Christian Science Monitor, Julius Nyerere, president of the Tanganyika African National Union, in all probability, the first prime minister of Tanganyika. Now, here is Mrs. Roosevelt.
Although we in America can understand the Africans' resentment against outside domination, we cannot help but worry whether the newly independent nations, who have virtually no preparation for independence, can make a go of it. Given the demand of quick and efficient development, what will happen to traditional safeguards for political and social democracy, for example? On the first program of this series, I mentioned that nationalism seemed to be moving too rapidly in Africa. At that time, of course, independence for the Belgian Congo was in the distant future. Today, we know that the Congo will become free on June 30th of this year, after a headlong rush toward independence. The people of Tanganyika seem to be approaching independence at a much more deliberate rate. Mr. Nyerere, I wonder if, to begin this program, you would give us just a quick sketch of your country and the character of its people.
Well, perhaps the quickest sketch I can give of my country is to say, this I've learned from this country, it is roughly the size of Texas. It has 9 million people. Of these 9 million people, we have the indigenous tribes, the 120 of them. Then we have the newer tribes, some from Europe, some from Asian Arabs, and the Indians and the Pakistanis, Greeks, Englishmen, Germans, Italians, and all this. And it's these people whom we are trying to weld in a nation, and it's among these people that I have organized the Tanganyika African National Union, of which I am president, and trying to get independence for the country.
Well, now that is a very good sketch, and I'd like to ask the three of our guests today whether you feel that independence is coming too fast in Africa.
May I just say a word
Yes,
on that
Ralph.
question, Mrs. Roosevelt? I understand very well that this is a valid question and one which many people are asking. But I really wonder whether we could do very much worthwhile in discussing it, because I really think there's not much that can be done about it. Moreover, I think that it would be extremely difficult to generalize with regard to Africa on this subject. I know of no absolute criteria for determining when a people are ready for independence.
Perhaps we didn't ask it ourselves
We didn't,
in the early days of our history.
We didn't ask that question ourselves, and I think probably a good case could be made for saying that we weren't ready when we got it. But the people of Africa are moving toward independence. When people are seeking freedom, they're always impatient, and I think that's good that they're impatient. And I wonder if Barbara Ward would...
Oh, no, I entirely agree. I think that when nations are set for independence and want it, then everything must be done to help them and encourage them and see that they get it. Because, after all, if we don't believe in the right of peoples to govern themselves, I don't know what we do believe in. But I think that there are one or two particular problems that face Africa, and that is the gap between the political form of a modern state and the extraordinary degree of technical and economic sophistication which goes into the making of a state. And I think when people talk about independence coming too quickly, they don't mean in any absolute sense that people aren't ready to govern themselves. They do ask, have they got some of these essential skills and equipments to do it well when they've got it?
Why did it come so quickly, though? Shouldn't we look into that question for a moment? Because the timetable has been condensed, almost catapulted. We have this remarkable agreement on independence for the Congo in June. It's just come out of Belgium. We have this conference that's just taken place in London on Kenya. And when Tom Mboya, the Kenya leader, got back home, he said that this wasn't going to last for very long, that he expected that there would be an African majority very, very soon in Kenya. Why has it happened so quickly?
Well, in the first place, I think the actual answer is, to us, the question ready does not arise. if you come into my house and steal my jacket, don't then ask me whether I'm ready for my jacket. The jacket was mine. You had no right at all to take it from me.
Yes, but it takes long.
It may take a long time to go to the high courts and appeal and get all this done until I get my jacket back. But you have no right at all to ask me whether I was ready for my jacket.
True.
The mechanism of whether really I can look right in my jacket when I put it on, this is different. I mean, it may not be as, I may not look as smart in it as you look in it, but it's mine.
This is your side of it, and is very significant as your side of it. Isn't it also significant, though, that the colonial powers appear to have crossed the big divide for themselves and come to the conclusion that they have to expect African majorities in the countries of Africa now? Isn't that the big decision which they've made?
But, Saville, you said the timetable has been changed. Who set the timetable?
The expectations of people who probably didn't understand what was happening.
That's quite right, exactly. Yes. So there was no timetable.
Touché.
There was no
timetable.
timetable.
Yes.
There were, as you say, expectations on the part of people who had their own ideas as to what the pace of progress should be. But on this subject, let me point this out. The question was, are they going too fast or are they ready? I think it's most fortunate that these states of Africa are emerging into independence at a period in the world's history unlike any other period, when there is more sense of interdependence among states, more sense of solidarity in an international community, when for the first time there is a sense of responsibility on the part of a world community to aid those who are emerging. And so it seems to me the question is more valid if we say, what can the international community do to help these people after they gained independence, whether they were really ready for it or not in terms of
Well, I must say I agree with that very much, and I think it does tie up with what you were asking before, and that is why has the timetable why is it speeded up? I think it's speeded up owing to a very big historical change in mankind, which may be the most important one that's happened since, well, I wouldn't know how long, perhaps the invention of the wheel. And that is the idea that small nations, small groups, have the right not to be run by big groups. Now, this is revolutionary. It isn't yet entirely accepted in a worldwide sense, because you have the Russians still insisting on running Hungary, you have the Chinese still insisting on running Tibet, you have a very ambiguous situation in Algeria, and above all for Africa, you have the Union, which is the big
colonial powers, not only the Union, the colonial powers.
I say French, the French, the others are going, don't you think?
Well, the others are being made to go. It's not as if really they have decided gracefully to go out. They are being made to go out.
Well, it's a mixture. It's a mixture because
it's a mixture imposed upon them by the time. But if really time hadn't been, if this had not been the 20th century, these people would have insisted on remaining staying.
That is what I mean, though, Mr. Nyerere. That is, there is this change in thinking that there are a number of people in Europe who feel that they should go at a time when the people in Africa feel they should too.
I wonder whether really we're not overlooking one of the most central things, namely that if we had not had the United Nations, this might have been delayed a long while. The thing that makes it secure for small nations today is the fact that the United Nations exists.
Well, I'm not sure. I think it helps, but I must confess I do think that the British decision to get out of India was not a United Nations decision and was in the historical pattern.
This isn't what I mean. I don't mean that the United Nations makes the decision, but I mean that the feeling of confidence that the small nations have lies largely in the fact that since there is a United Nations and that it does have an effect on world opinion,
it's a forum, yes.
It's a forum where they can be sure of being heard.
It's more than that, even for them, Mrs. Roosevelt. It ties up with the question that Saville put a minute ago. Why have the people increased the pace? Why have they decided to go so fast? Well, the background for that, of course, was in part the fact that at the end of World War II, the Union, the spotlight of international opinion on the colonialism as it never had been turned before. The background for that was the Atlantic Pact, the Four Freedoms, the fact that colonial people themselves were participating in a war for freedom, and they came home and wanted it. And so they wanted increased pace. Moreover, in addition to what Mrs. Roosevelt has said, the international community organized in the United Nations today is a sort of international club. These new states emerging into independence are not lonely anymore. They can come into this organization. They're not dependent upon their former masters. They sit as equals with all the other states. They feel a part of an international community. They can get help from it, which is their right to do. And so this gives them an encouragement which they otherwise could not have.
Yeah, that's all right as long as you get away from the right colonial power. But it's absolutely no consolation to Eastern Europe or last of the Tibetans. I mean, I think it's right that you should stress the United Nations, and heaven knows I would stress it.
Yes.
But I think also you've got to have a certain degree of the beginnings of a liberal philosophy in the metropolitan power as well, because if you don't, well,
why don't we turn this question around, and instead of talking about the speed up of the timetable and whether it's too fast, let's talk about the problems that are being raised by the sudden oncoming of independence. And certainly Mr. Nyerere has his hands full of these, and we keep on hearing people say that he's handling them almost better than anybody else, if not better than anybody else. So we might ask him a little bit, how would a multiracial society, for example, operate in Tanganyika when you have fully taken over power, Mr. Nyerere?
Well, first, we don't like to refer to our society as a multiracial society, because this was a political term which was created, I think, largely by the colonial powers to show that we were in a special category either in Africa or in the world. And in actual fact, it's not true. The whole, where is a part of the world which which is not multiracial. I mean, the whole world
is
groups of people living together. This was a political term created in our part of Africa, in East, Central, and South Africa, and this was the problem, where democracy could not work, because this was a big problem there. For that reason, we don't like to refer to the term multiracial.
It's very hard to avoid using these sensitive phrases. What should we refer to?
Well, why? I mean, why? I've never heard the word being used applied to England or applied to Germany or even this country, which is clearly multiracial.
It's not quite as easy to apply it to England, but to this country, it has to be applied.
It should be applied, but it's not.
We have our Scots and our
Well,
Welsh.
only so now.
Should we say a democratic society?
Exactly. At home.
If I could interrupt just a moment, I think it ought to be made clear why this point is so important to Mr. Nyerere, because he's the one African leader in the whole continent who is leading all groups in his society, with not only Africans, but with Asians and Europeans in the party.
And they're working together?
Yeah,
working together under his leadership.
Let me say that at home, the Europeans, the Asians, the Africans, and that's why in my first answer I referred to them as the indigenous tribes and the new tribes in Tanganyika.
I got that.
I got that too.
These are all Tanganyikans who are binding themselves together to achieve their independence and build a Tanganyika nation. They are, whether they came from Asia or they came from Greece or they came from England, these are Tanganyika nationalists. Their rights are not rights of Europeans or rights of Africans or rights of Asians or rights of Arabs. These are rights of individual citizens of Tanganyika. And I don't see why in Tanganyika we cannot base our rights of citizenship, our duties of citizenship on loyalty to the country instead of the color of a person's skin or the texture of a person's hair. We see ourselves that this is not a problem which has started in Tanganyika. It has always been there, and if people want to build a democratic society, they can build it.
Well, just to raise some of the really difficult problems, at least that there are in other countries, are you up against the kind of problem, for example, such as Kenya has in the land in the highlands? Do you have a land reform problem or program that you've got to work out? Have the whites had any special positions which will need to be merged into the new democracy?
No, fortunately we don't have, we never in Tanganyika reserved the whole province and called this the Kenya Highlands or the Tanganyika Highlands. We have no Tanganyika Highlands.
One should, bearing out Dr. Bunch's point, say that one reason why is that in 1919 Tanganyika came under an old League of Nations mandate, and therefore this kind of transfer couldn't occur. Isn't that one of the reasons?
Well, I must not leave it there. It would be very unfair to the British if I just left it there. It depends also upon the administering power, because after all, Southwest Africa was a mandate too.
True.
I think you've got to put the mandate status or the trust status must not be taken separately from the mandatory power or the administering authority. In Tanganyika, we didn't have a Tanganyika Highlands, and therefore, to us, it's not as if the Europeans had a group, a province, which was their province. They have individual rights to land, and we say we are quite prepared to see as long as they're citizens of the country. That's all.
Now, against this background, would you have any suggestions as to either how your experience might help Kenya and Tom Maboya and his colleagues next door to your country, or have you any idea of how they might work out that very difficult land reform problem? Are they going to be able to work it out peaceably?
Well, I have said before, and I think I can repeat it because to me it's quite obvious, that I have no lesson to teach to Tom Mboya and the other Kenya African leaders. The lesson from Tanganyika is a lesson by the Europeans and the Asians, and it's the Europeans in Kenya who must learn from the Europeans in Tanganyika, who must look upon themselves as individual citizens of Kenya, and must seek for individual rights and not for European rights.
Not for racial rights.
Not for racial rights.
Are you at all hopeful that that will happen in Kenya after the London conference?
I'm certain that is going to happen.
I must say that I would agree. If you think of the change in the Kenyan outlook in the last 10 years, the emergence of men like Mr. Blundell, who are feeling their way to precisely this concept, not of group rights, but of individual rights. I'd go all the way with Mr. Nyerere on that. I think it's going to come, though I think there might well be a small, hard core who won't accept the new order.
Will they leave?
They should leave, because after all, if you don't accept the condition in which of the country in which you're going to live, then this has happened to others after all.
Well, the press reports are accurate. Some of them are leaving or preparing to leave already, because I've read reports of fine villas for sale and so on. And
mind you, I do think, just one little point on that. I do think, nonetheless, that as it's awfully hard to make a small group of people pay for a history which they don't understand, that I think it would be reasonable for the British government at some point to give some compensation to take them away. Because this is some sort of, if they go leaving behind fully developed estates, then give them some transfer pay, because, you know, they haven't caught up, but it's awfully hard to penalize them. But that isn't a matter for Africa, that's a matter for the British government.
What is penalizing? I mean, quite frankly, this is absurd. These fellows are offered rights of citizenship in Kenya. If they quit, who compensates them?
Well, then let them sell out.
No, nobody's punishing them. People are offering them stay in Kenya as a Kenya citizen with equal rights with everybody. You quit. If you quit, what compensation do you want?
With a Bill of Rights to protect them.
With a Bill of Rights to protect them.
Yes, I think you're allowing for a degree of reason in older people, which isn't always there. And I think it's awfully hard to expect older groups, especially small ones, to understand this. I mean, I agree with you, but I just wonder whether you can't ease some transitions.
Well, this would be the British. I mean, I can't see the Kenyan national.
Oh, no, I don't mean that. I was thinking about the British government doing this. No, I didn't suggest for a moment it should be the Kenyan government.
No. I think I understand what you mean, because I can see that they came there probably feeling they were helping to develop something for the British government. They have developed something for the British government, but certainly not along the lines
of Kenya should do it. No,
Kenya.
Not that. No, don't.
No. I've got it.
Mrs. Roosevelt, I wonder if I could revert for a moment with a question to your introductory statement. As I recall, you made reference to democratic institutions, what might be needed to enable these new states to carry them. And I'd like to put this question to Mr. Nyerere. It seems to me that we in this country may be in for some disillusionment if we assume that these newly independent states on the African continent are going to model their political and economic systems pretty much after our own, that is, along the lines of what we call Western democracy, Western parliamentary institutions.
That's going to happen to us in many countries, not only
that's
in
right.
Africa.
And I'm afraid that may not be the course in Africa for many reasons, because they will not find them suitable to their needs for other reasons. But I'd like to hear Mr. Nyerere's views on that subject.
Well, I must say, I've since I've been here during the last 5 weeks, I've been asked this question: are we going to form democracies in Africa, or are we going to be dictatorships and all this? And actually, the question has come round on whether we are going to have a multi-party system in Africa, whether we are going to have a mono-party system, whether the governments of our countries are going to be one-party governments or not. Now, I must say, I believe I'm a Democrat myself. On the other hand, I cannot see how in a country like Tanganyika you could have a two-party system, certainly for the first years. We are an opposition, after all. We are an opposition to the colonial government which is already there. We build the whole people together. To us, this is not a party issue. This is a national issue to us. And we have all the people united together, not in actual fact in a political party, but in a nationalist movement. And it is this nationalist movement with all the people, intending communists, intending capitalists, intending socialists, all sorts. They're all there until they've achieved their freedom. Then it is this nationalist movement which forms the very first government. Now, an opposition can only arise when the issues are there.
May I just interrupt at that point? For this explanation, in this country, Mr. Nyerere, there is a tendency on the part of some people to attribute to nationalism only bad connotation. It's almost a bad word suddenly, and that it's nationalism that's running wild in Africa, you see. I would submit that there are good and bad manifestations of nationalism even today, and anyhow, I think what the people of Africa are after is freedom.
Well, that's true, and I think to an American audience it should not really be very difficult, because after all, what happened when the Americans wanted their freedom? They united themselves all together. They formed a one-party government, in actual fact, until the issues were then defined for the parties to group themselves separately. Not on the issue of the Declaration of Independence. How could you have an opposition to the Declaration of Independence?
No, you didn't have.
Could you tell us then, how would freedom and the democratic system and the ballot box and so forth operate through the kind of one-party system that you're describing?
In September, in my own country, we are going to have an election. This is going to be a true and free election. And we are certain of winning all the 71 seats. We are certain of that because there is the opposition, which is the present government, and we are going to fight all the seats and we'll win all the seats. This is a true election. Does this mean there is no democracy in the country? No, it's not true, because within the nationalist movement itself, you have groups with different views. And when you come to actual policy, especially after you have formed the government, when you come to how you are going to tax the people, how you are going to spend money on education, how you are going to spend money on health, and how you are going to spend money on
the issues will come up.
The issues will define themselves, yes. And you have the democratic sections.
But you say you have one party and there is an opposition. You do not rule out by law the possibility of an opposition party.
No, I don't. In actual fact, I hope an opposition is going to come, but an opposition must have a respectable issue. Yes. And a respectable issue can only come after independence.
It ought to be real and not synthetic.
It's got to be real. You can't.
I think there's an analogy here between the way in which the party system developed in the West. I mean, we seem to think that we got a party system in the early stages of free government. This is not the case. No. The party system is a late development. And I think that what is perfectly compatible with, say, the first 25 years of independence is this movement of national union to tackle the appalling problems which lie in creating the state. On the other hand, there is another aspect of democracy which perhaps we don't think of quite so much, but was also important, and that is, while having this tremendous national effort to build the nation up, then it's also important to safeguard just those individual rights about which you were speaking. In other words, the Bill of Rights is as fully as important to a democracy as this party thing. And I think we over-insist on the party and under-insist, in a sense, in our thinking.
Freedoms of the individual.
To me, it was a very exciting thing that the Kenya group in London, the Africans in London at the Kenya conference, brought Thurgood Marshall from the United States, an American Negro, to advise them on what amounted to setting up a system of human rights which would operate for the benefit of the whites in Kenya, ultimately.
Well, no one could be better qualified to work on a Bill of Rights than Thurgood Marshall.
And in this case,
this was what we might call a little poetic justice.
It was a little poetic justice, a lot of poetic justice.
Another point on this question of the Bill of Rights, because even this I don't think is entirely simple, because our concept of the Bill of Rights is built up upon very internally peaceful societies. But I do notice one thing, and this is inevitable, with human nature being what it is, that the moment there is a real national crisis, we do to some extent bridge our own Bill of Rights. And I think a lot of the criticism, for example, directed now at Ghana, about aspects of the abridgment of the Bill of Rights, which are regrettable, overlook the extent to which there are tribal elements in these societies which try to pull them apart again. In other words, nation building is not always easy in a highly tribal state. And therefore, this too must be taken into account. I don't think you have this problem in Tanzania.
We don't have it, but there is another one. I think this question of democracy and all this, first, you were right in saying democracy must emphasize the rights of the individual and the way a government is chosen. I keep on saying myself, if a government cannot be removed without assassination, there is no democracy there. No. It's really the individual rights and the way a government...
The right of judging the government through elections, yes.
Now, in Africa, we have the problem you are mentioning, that of building a nation from this country which is artificial by nature. You have these tribes together and you try to make them into a nation. This is a problem. The other one, which the older nations never faced when they became independent, is this push to develop the countries. We've got to develop our countries. We've got to give the people water, education, and all this. This is 20th century.
And suddenly,
you can't. A weak government in our countries cannot do this.
No, and you haven't got the capital, which perhaps you had when you were under a big power. You might count on a certain amount going in.
The outside world is all the time saying, Julius, what are you doing in Tanganyika?
Yes.
They want me to work miracles in the country, and then they want me to have a very weak government which can't do anything in the country.
How right you are.
Well, this brings us logically to the point of turning around now to the question of economic development and some of the very real difficulties that not only you but all of independent Africa is facing. Where is the money coming from? If the funds which have normally come from colonial countries are partly cut off or largely cut off, where is the investment coming from?
First, I must, this question of funds which have come from the colonial powers. Let me say, I don't know what other countries have received from the colonial powers. We in Tanganyika have not received very much. We have the refugee scheme. Dr. Banchwe will know about the refugee scheme, where we need about 8 million pounds. The other day I was working in my mind. The British, including the Germans, during the 75 years that we have been under colonial rule, if we put all the money together, which we have received both from Germany and Britain, it does not add up to 1/5 of what I need for the refugee scheme. So that this emphasis of our money we have been getting from the colonial powers is not really very much. We've been a poor people all the time. And it won't change our poverty very much by becoming independent.
This is true of Tanganyika, but there was a big change after the war from about 1944 onwards. And one of the problems for French West Africa, for example, is that the French government has been putting in something like $250 million worth of infrastructure, for ports and harbors. They've had their interest in doing it, but it's been, it's been cash. It's been cash. And what is the great question is, can one find ways of ensuring this flow of capital, which heaven knows is needed for maximum speed and development, without it merely being another form of colonial control?
Well, I feel the answer can be provided in this, that I think one of the problems of Africa is going to be just this need. Our need for technical assistance, for finance to develop our country is a fact. It's there. Nobody can doubt it. Where I hope the countries capable of providing this aid won't involve us in a problem is they must not exploit our need in order to get us involved in international politics in which we are not really very much.
Well, this brings us right back to Ralph Bunch again, doesn't
I'd like to get back to Barbara's question.
Well, we'll take it in order.
Because your husband, Barbara Commander Jackson, is very much involved in just one of these
the Commissioner for Development
the schemes,
yes.
And I wonder if you wouldn't say a word about the Volta River project.
Well, the point is, Ghana isn't entirely typical of the problem because owing to the fact that the cocoa crop is owned by the peasant farmer and is not an external plantation crop, a very large part of the money from cocoa has stayed in the country. Point number one. Point number two, cocoa has remained high since the war, and therefore it hasn't suffered from these enormous ups and downs of primary prices, which is the thing I know that Mr. Nyerere must feel very strongly about, because we give capital on one hand and then say, whoop, down goes the price, and all the capital is virtually gone again. This is a very curious way of running a railway, as they say. Well, but Ghana doesn't quite have that problem. But Ghana, on the other hand, has got a large resources in bauxite, and the whole of the west coast of Africa has got this tremendous supplies of potential hydroelectric power, which would be a potential for growth and for development on such a scale that you could consider the transformation of economies on the basis of this power. And where, pray, do they get the capital from? Well, now, the Volta scheme, I think, is a perfect example of how not to do things, because every 5 years this scheme has been in the forefront of Western discussion, how they're going to do it, how it's going to be essential. Then we have a moderate recession. Everyone says, oh, heavens, we've got so much bauxite, we've got so much aluminum, of course we can't do it. Down goes the scheme again. And I just wait, I must confess, for the day when the Russians begin to get thoroughly interested in Africa. Because when they do, then this whole question of Western primary prices that go up and down like this, and Western interest in development that goes up and down with our trade recession, it's going to look very, very stupid. That's all I can say. In other words, we need a policy.
You've raised one of the hardest problems that the West is up against, haven't you? Because we have tried all kinds of marketing boards and price stabilization programs, and on the whole, up until now, we've fallen flat on our faces.
I don't think we've tried awfully hard.
Well, that's the point I was going to raise.
Indeed.
Haven't we still got a little distance yet to go? I was talking with a group of economists recently who took this position. No one of them was willing to say this is the way to do it, but they all said this is a problem that we can, with ingenuity and the desire to do it, solve.
Now, you've put your finger up with a desire. Now, what I think is lacking is that, that the Western powers have simply not just faced up to the problem of capital for Africa. They either do it on a ex-metropolitan, ex-colonial basis, or they do it on a private venture capital which won't go in because they think things are insecure, or they rely on export income, which goes up and down.
Well, that's what you just said. They think things are insecure.
Yes.
And that is one of the troubles that we've watched for a long time in South America, and we're going to see it in countries of Africa. Capital, which is private capital, is going to be very uncertain. It's on and off because it doesn't feel that it's risking in a secure spot. That's one reason why I think Ralph Bunche comes in, because I believe that this will do much better when it comes through an organization where many people are involved.
An international organization.
An international organization.
Through the United Nations, I would say. I think that's what you were going to raise a moment ago. The question of what is commonly defined as the issue of multilateral versus bilateral aid.
Both in technical assistance and even in capital investment.
Yes, but don't let's kid ourselves and that nothing's going to come through the United Nations unless the capital-rich countries have decided to do it. So, I mean, I would go one step behind and say they haven't yet decided to do it.
But I think they have to be brought to do it that way, unless they're willing to do it on their own.
They move slowly, but they do move. In the last couple of years, we've had action, in addition to the regular technical assistance program, on the special fund for capital development, which Paul Hoffman heads, on OPEX, this operation to provide high-level executive personnel to new governments that need it. It means a little addition to the assistance.
And the International Development Association, if properly developed,
could do the same thing. But I think I should mention that the African states, and some of them not yet independent as associate members, meeting in Tangier at the end of January in the Economic Commission for Africa, were overwhelmingly in favor of international multilateral or United Nations aid instead of bilateral.
It's the only thing, isn't it, that takes this sort of colonial taint off, as it were.
Well, not the colonial one alone. Not the colonial one alone. There is the colonial one where the metropolitan power, after colonialism number one is off, they want to use colonialism number two, which is an economic one. There is that one, and which we resent. But the other one is in the world in which we find ourselves now, of a communist world and a non-communist world. We get involved in the politics of this rivalry, and our need for capital, for aid, is exploited to force us into one of the blocks or another. And we feel, for those two reasons, to avoid, again, a continuation of a new colonialism, and to avoid getting into issues which to us are not really the issues. The issues now in Africa are to raise the standard of living of our people.
Not the Cold
War. Doesn't that bring us
and therefore we feel channeling an aid through a United Nations agency is the answer. If the nations are genuine in doing this, why do they want to compete about it? They can put all the money and all the aid through a United Nations agency and let the needing countries get the money from them.
Doesn't this bring us up
used most efficiently?
Most efficiently.
Why don't we now face the difficult question? I don't believe any of us particularly wants to dive into the problem of communism and the problem of East versus West in Africa, but it's on the minds of a great many people in this country, and we probably ought to face it head on.
May I say this? Much more on the minds of the people in this country than on the minds of the people of Africa. You don't counter it.
I would say there's one aim that we should have in the West, and that is by every means in our power to keep the Cold War out of Africa. And not to consider our policies in these terms at all.
In that case, since you're all agreed on that, and since I also agree with you, let me play the devil's advocate and argue the other side of the case for a moment against my own position. We have here probably only one case where communism in Africa has become an issue in the news, which is Guinea, with, $35 million that Mr. Khrushchev has loaned to Guinea, and I believe now the Soviet Union has tied up about 60% of the exports of
And they
Guinea.
printed the banknotes.
To a great many people, and they printed the banknotes, to a great many people in this country, that raises the kind of warning which the United States didn't want to have to face after World War II, but found that it had to face. Namely, the question of infiltration, which is in actual fact, a more serious problem than many of us are willing to recognize. Have we such a problem here?
Why should it, since you're playing the role of devil's advocate, maybe you'd answer this question. Why should it be considered so, in view of the fact that one reads regularly in the press that trade between the United States and the Soviet Union is increasing?
Well, I think the answer to that, which probably would be given, is simply that if the communist system managed to get its hooks sufficiently far into a country economically so that it would be able to play it like a fish on the end of a line, so to speak, then it would be able to use that for its political
But, Mr.
advantage.
Davis, there's only one condition under which that would be the case, and that would be if the West merely said, well, we now will have nothing more to do with this country.
Yes.
Whereas in point of fact, we've heard this. We heard this when Khrushchev first went into India. We heard it when he first lent money to Indonesia. We heard it when there was a barter deal with Ceylon and Burma. And we heard it, heaven knows, last year about Iraq. The thing with looking at all these countries is quite clear is they have continued to be themselves. And I think that Africa should have the benefit of that.
I think you must recall the headlines when, some years ago, when it was agreed by India that the Soviet Union was to build a steel mill.
Yes.
Oh, my.
Yes, exactly. On the other hand, just to argue the point one small step further, I think it probably is a fact, although I myself as an individual have been very uncomfortable about the American containment policy, that it probably succeeded in holding the line out through the Asian areas until those countries themselves were able to reach the point which they have reached now, where they understand the problem that they're up against and are willing to take a position against
I
infiltration.
disagree there. I must confess, I entirely disagree. I don't think it had anything to do with holding the line in Asia. I think containment did something quite definite in Europe, but that's different. And I just don't think it's relevant. The relevant thing in Africa is that Africa should be able to grow and develop and get going. And if we have the right policies, there is absolutely no reason why Cold War situations should develop. Anyway,
I must say, I don't like this attitude of the West hammering on communism and communist infiltration in Africa and all this business. What has communism to do with us? In the first place, at present, it's not an issue at all. But in the second place, it does no good to the Western powers themselves. Here we are, needing assistance. And the Western powers, in actual fact, are saying, if it had not been for Moscow, we don't look at Africa at all. But Moscow is there, now we must look at Africa. Because if we don't do it, the communists will come in. Now, let me put the question you put about Guinea getting some assistance from Russia. Supposing I got some assistance from the United States of America. Is this infiltration? Is this what the United States intend, infiltration? Connecting?
There is an inconsistency about it, as a matter of fact, because Ethiopia has received assistance from...
Is that American infiltration?
But no one is claiming that Ethiopia is subject to that.
Swedish infiltration.
But in Guinea, it's different, you see.
Now to switch around in exactly the opposite direction, is it perhaps possible, and are we saying here, that the continent of Africa might give the United States and American foreign policy its first chance to deal with the problems of developing countries without having to raise the communist bogey, and to turn its back on what obviously has been one of the bitterest aspects of our relationship with with many of the countries which are in a unaligned position in Asia.
I agree with you if you eliminate the word first.
Yes.
I've said myself to some of my American friends that if I had a few communists in my pocket in Tanganyika, I would wave them. And I don't have them. I don't know what I'm going to do.
They'd be worth a great deal of money, wouldn't they?
Well, there's an old story about that. You know, it's a way to get aid.
That is very good. That is a story that should be told, because here he is. He'd like to have them to wave when he's trying to get them.
Yes.
But still, all the same, I do think in fairness now to the Western governments, you have also to say that in the case of India, which I've followed very closely, steadily over the last 10 years, the realization has come that if the Indian plan is worth backing, it's worth backing because it is the Indian plan, period. And I would say that this is the attitude that we must have for Africa. Africa is worth helping to develop because it's the main interest of the Africans to do it and to get ahead.
In other words, the best policy for the United States is to encourage non-alignment and the individual integrity of African countries.
And I would say there is another thing to be remembered, and I would like to ask you, Ralph Bunch, and that is, isn't Africa at present offering an opportunity to young America? Because after all, the people who are going to be important in Africa, many of them are going to be young. Yes. Isn't it offering to young America, if they are willing to take it, an opportunity for service, which we have not had, perhaps, in a long while before?
I fully agree. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. I think what's happening in Africa today is just about the most exciting thing in the world today. There's a great need for assistance, trained people of all kinds. I could only wish that we in this country had much more knowledge of Africa than we have.
That's what I'm wondering.
We're only awakening to it now. I think our schools, our colleges, our universities are very delinquent in this regard because there's very little taught anywhere in our schools about Africa. There's very little opportunity for Americans to learn about it. They're beginning to read about it in the press because it's news, but there's no background of knowledge about it which prepares our people to take full advantage of these opportunities.
Could I put in a little cynical word at this point? And that is that although I think it's absolutely true, and particularly in the whole field of education, there could be a tremendous amount of useful interchange of help given to Africa by sending technicians and people of quality, the fact remains that unless we make some changes in our methods of promotion back home, they won't go. Because a young man...
By promotion back home, what do you mean?
A young man in a university, he may be exactly the kind of person who could do a splendid job in, say, East Africa. To be useful, he should stay there 5 years because, you know, I think Mr. Nyerere will agree, these experts who come in for 6 months, they might just as well stay home. They really should. But 5 years, good, you can make a contribution. And then when you come back at the end of 5 years, who's headmaster at the local high school? It isn't you. In other words, you lose this continuity. And I think that if both education institutions and business firms would make it a rule that for the upper reaches of administration, people would have had to serve abroad, you'd get better people. At the same time, you would improve the quality of top leadership. And this is perhaps interesting as well.
I'd endorse that most heartily and say we could use the same principle in the United Nations.
Well, I think you're right. I think that in the United States, that's one of the big changes we need, an understanding that anyone who is willing to give a certain amount of time in a nation outside of their own country has a certain credit given them for that at home, that it's a regular procedure, that they are considered on a higher level when they return, for the simple reason that they're doing a great deal for their own country. Our great trouble is that we don't know anything about Africa. Well, we don't know anything.
This would help, too, Mrs. Roosevelt, wouldn't it, to solve what I suppose we refer to nowadays somewhat loosely as our ugly American problem. Yes. So many Americans go over to these countries, not by any means the people that we would like to send, of the quality that we would like to send, or with the training and experience that we would like to send, and they find themselves maladjusted and complaining about their status in the local consulate and wondering when they can get out of this awful place in order to get somewhere else. You spoke about the younger people a moment ago. It seems to me that the younger people in this country, as I see them going around from schools and colleges, are ready for this kind of thing. They're the ones who want to do it.
Well, they're the ones who are very anxious to do it if they get the chance.
I'd love to ask Mr. Nyerere about an idea which I must say I think of immense importance for Africa, and I'm sure that Ralph will agree, and that is that we don't really have, attached to the UN, a really high-grade pool of administrative civil servants of high quality who can feed in over the next 25 years, who can help in governments in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I would add Europe, for heaven's sake, because I can think of a number of governments that could need some help there, too.
Don't omit the Western Hemisphere.
But just have this idea that there is a trained body of men on whom governments can call if they need someone. Don't you think this would be a helpful thing?
It's exactly the same thing. I mean, you know, Ghana, for instance. Ghana had to retain some British civil servants there. We have been appealing ourselves to the European civil servants in Tanganyika to remain after independence. Now, this again, I mean, Guinea is another typical example where the French just pulled out. And here was Guinea left out without people. Now, a pool at the United Nations, if the United Nations could work for us as a labor exchange for
This is exactly the purpose of OPEC.
Yeah, but I must say that actually I've heard people at the United Nations discuss it.
There's one thought I think also we ought to make. This is sort of warning to the American public as to what may happen in Africa on the economic front, because this will again involve their appraisal of what's happening there. I think it's inevitable that in Africa economic progress and considerable economic progress has been made in the last decade, that this will more and more involve action by government, initiative by government rather than by private entrepreneurs. The governments will be taking the place of private entrepreneurs, not only in planning, in investment operations, and even in managerial work. And so this may very easily be misinterpreted.
I love how I agree, and I do think there's nothing that one can say to America on this subject that is more important than this. In the situation of the underdeveloped areas, the important thing to remember is that what private enterprise needs is firm government action, affirmative government action, and big government action. Because if you don't have that in these countries, you will have no development at all. Therefore, this idea that there's a conflict between the two is nonsense. There's not.
I think the American people, on the whole, have passed that hurdle, particularly in the case of India. They're recognizing that they have to work with governments. There's also a very interesting wrinkle which has come up recently. It's been suggested by a number of Americans, notably Donald David of the Ford Foundation, that American private concerns could be very profitably hired on a contract basis by governments in Africa, for example, so that they are entirely subject to the African government, to the conditions, to the government setting the conditions under which they operate, so the government has complete control from its point of view. Meanwhile, the private company, under contract, brings in its technicians and its know-how and its management and all the rest of it. That seems to be a fairly promising.
But that, of course, is something that is, take the Kariba Dam. That's exactly how it's been built. I mean, the Kariba Dam is government and World Bank money, and a very large Italian firm doing the building. I mean, this is common form.
We haven't said a word about federation and the federal question in Africa.
You have only a few minutes. Let Mr. Nyerere say it.
What can I say about that?
Well, is it coming? Is it coming or isn't it?
Well, could you tie up with it also some comments on what we commonly hear as Pan-Africanism?
No, all I can say, I mean, in the 1 minute left is
you have several minutes. You have 3 minutes.
That there is a sentiment of oneness in Africa which you don't find anywhere else in any other continent. That one, we don't have to take credit for it. It has been imposed upon us by the colonial situation itself. The states which are going to receive independence are the colonial ones, which were cut out by the colonial powers. The tendency will be for these states to group themselves together in bigger units. Where this eventually will lead to, I don't know. I can't tell. But the tendency will be towards bigger groupings.
At the moment, people seem to be somewhat discouraged about federalism. They're saying that some of the early experiments in this direction or moves in this direction have failed. It seemed to me that this was being pessimistic too soon.
Where?
Where have they failed?
Where have they failed?
Well, there was always the question raised of Ghana and Guinea, and
good heavens.
Still there.
The African,
yes, there have been the
African
problems of Mali. There have been several cases of where...
Oh, no, I don't think
But
there's anything
the
to go
truth is we haven't started yet. The biggest federation in Africa is Nigeria, which has not been given a chance yet. And I think it's going to be a great success.
Well, I don't want to cut this off, but there's one question I'm just dying to ask
The UN bloc.
Julius here. No. Before we wind up. Because I want to check his views with my own impressions and observations. I think it's very important. On this month-long trip through Africa, despite all the ferment going on there, I was impressed by the fact that talking with Africans, west, central, east, north, there's not the slightest evidence anywhere of any racial feeling, of any racial animosity, even in areas where there was actual friction and conflict. And I think that's a very encouraging thing. Do you agree that there is no racial feeling on the part of the Africans?
I think we have been able to distinguish the colonial issue from the racial issue.
Right.
May I put in a word there for West Africa from Ghana? This is absolutely true of Ghana.
Yes?
There is no racialism.
Very...
Again, this has been created in the minds of people who've looked on from a distance and who don't really know the facts.
That's right.
Brings us back to the fact that we ought to be studying Africa just as we are this afternoon, somewhat more carefully.
Yes.
Now, you have, I think, laid the fears of a great many people today. They have much less to fear in some ways by the answer to that question. You really feel there is no racial trouble going to arise.
Counted not the least racial animosity anyway.
I would go further than that. I would say that in Ghana, you have a society where you reach the blessed stage in which people aren't even bothering to think about it.
Well, now I have to say that our time has come to a close, and I have to thank you very much, Mr. Nyerere, for coming to us today from far away, and you, Barbara Ward, Lady Jackson. We are very grateful to you, and also to you, Ralph Bunch, because I know how busy you are and how hard it is to come away. And so I thank you too, Mr. Davis, who are with us each time. And it has been a great pleasure. And now I want to say that next month we will talk about the picture, the image of the United States abroad. Until then, au revoir.